Welcome, everybody. We are going to be talking today about financial operations on Azure. This is maybe the opportunity you have to put the fun in finance, and it may be the most boring content you've heard all week, but we're going to really endeavor to make it useful for you and something you can take back to your business to have measurable impact. And I think that's why we're all here, is to impact the opportunity for us to be most efficient in our cloud spend. And you have some really interesting opportunities here to be able to take advantage of that. So we are going to go through about 20 different ways that you can optimize your cloud spend in Azure. So if one of those doesn't apply to you, you're probably not trying. So we're going to go through all those 20. We're going to talk about some of the gold standard things you should be able to do in your environment. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're here in the first place. And we're even going to show a couple examples of tooling that you can use to be able to make this happen, and then how you get started in making this real. So to start us today, we'll do a little bit of introductions and make sure you know who's talking with you. So kick it off. My name is Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I am a 13-time Microsoft Cloud MVP. I've been in consulting for 21 years, and I'm also a Ironman. I'm an active triathlete. I do a lot of racing and other athletic things, and I do so a lot with my family. I have 8 kids. 5 of them are actually triathletes as well. My daughter is nipping at my heels. She's beat me in a race before. And now every race, it's a little bit of nervousness as to whether or not I'm going to be able to beat her. So it's been a really awesome opportunity for me to be able to live a great consulting career so far, and also to be a dad. And I think the interesting commonality between those two things is that I'm never the smartest, I'm never the fastest in any one of those two things, but I always have something to share. And that's my goal today, is to share a little bit of what we've learned around financial operations in Azure, and to help you to be able to take advantage of some of the experiences that we've had. And maybe at some point we'll learn something also from what you're doing. One of the things I would encourage everyone to do today is actively use the chat. I think one of the most favorite things we've had from doing these events has been all the questions that people put in the chat, and to be able to answer them concurrently with us presenting. That's why we have 3 people on this event. We will be answering those questions as we go, and largely answering them in the context of the chat, and some we'll just take verbally at the end. But as we hit a particular topic and you have a question about it, put it in the chat, hit it. We'll try to answer it right there. Also connect with us on LinkedIn. So we're all active there. We're all trying to be active in the technology community to make us all better. So connect with us, ask us questions, engage. We'd love to be an asset to you in the way that you're trying to improve this technology in the field as well. All right, our next person to introduce is Reem. Reem, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Reem El-Zubaidi. I'm the practice manager for the Cloud and DevOps practice here at Concurrency. And thanks, Nate, for inviting me to this. I'm really excited. So a little bit about me. I have my master's in IT with a focus on data science, which is super relevant today. And I also am a certified Scrum Master. I've have about 5 years of experience in professional services, so quite a bit less than Nate, but definitely learning from him. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. Personally, love to travel. I'm living in Houston, so love the warm weather, and excited to get started. Gonna pass it off to Jack next.
Jack.
Yeah, hello everyone. Nice to be here. I'm Jack Stabil. I'm the practice manager for our digital operations practice, which kind of deals a lot with Reem's practice, but we deal more in like longer term support contracts for Concurrency. I've been working at Concurrency for about 4 years now, and I've been working in the Azure space for about 4 years. So once we get to our examples, I'll give some anecdotal evidence and advice of what we've done in the past for clients and how we've saved them money. So yeah, I'm excited to talk with everyone about what we can do to save Azure spend and how easy it is to save money in Azure, and how it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to save thousands in a short period of time. And for my picture, like Nate mentioned in the beginning, I live in downtown Milwaukee. That's my girlfriend Anna, and we're at Jazz in the Park in the one picture that Nate recognized. So not sure if anyone else goes around there, but beautiful weather for it, and I know it's starting up here pretty soon.
Love it. All right, so Reem is going to kick us off by just talking about why are we even having this conversation, which is to a degree obvious, but maybe sometimes not, because there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. So Reem, just tell us why we're here.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're here because we want to talk about financial operations in Azure, right? But what is the catalyst for this conversation? I think there are a few different things. So, firstly, as stewards of our cloud infrastructure and being generally responsible human beings, we do have a duty to ensure that we're being smart with our spend. And we know that there is a lot of waste in Azure, and it's easy to rack up if you're not paying attention. Secondly, with the backdrop of some economic uncertainty, we want to address a significant concern that many companies are facing, which is the need to tighten the belt while maintaining efficiency and productivity. Um, we all know recent times have been incredibly challenging for businesses across the globe. And with this economic downturn, companies have been forced to take drastic measures to reduce costs. So things like workforce reductions, budget tightening, have become normal. Um, but one area that often goes unnoticed is the tremendous potential for optimizing cloud services, particularly Azure consumption. In trying to mitigate these risks and navigate the landscape, we're really glad to have you here today, by the way, to talk through this because now it becomes really crucial to identify opportunities for cost optimization that can provide significant relief to your organization. Just imagine you guys, you go into work, you unlock the true power of Azure, you can achieve financial stability without compromising performance or functionality. You guys are going to be heroes at work, believe me. So today, Nathan and Jack and I will unveil some secrets of effectively utilizing Azure cost optimization practices that could revolutionize your organization's financial standing. As Jack said, there are some simple things you can do to make significant impact, save thousands in a short amount of time. And by optimizing Azure consumption, you'll not only reduce your cloud costs, but you'll kind of unleash a new level of efficiency and innovation. Um, so I want to take it away and hand it off to Nathan and Jack.
Thank you, Reem.
Thanks.
Okay, so when we think about the responsibilities that many of you may have, you probably sit somewhere in this zone of supporting the organization in being able to be effective at leveraging its cloud spend. What makes this conversation more complicated is there's a relationship between your cloud governance and cloud center of excellence and your cloud operations and many of the teams that are using the spend that are trying to drive revenue and operational savings. And oftentimes, they may have things left over. There's parts of the efficiency that they've left off the table, or maybe they aren't even really accountable for that spend. So today we're going to talk about how we unite a lot of these same concepts around very tactical ideas. But we're going to start by talking about some of the broader concepts that support this and ways you can look at the picture to know if you're being successful or not. So at its root, what we're essentially trying to do is add visibility to the overall picture of finance around the context of cloud spend. And in a previous slide, you saw that 20 to 40% of cloud spend is waste. And that's not just sort of a blown smoke sort of conversation. Most of the time, organizations are not applying the tools that they can apply to be able to gain the opportunities for reducing that spend. And you'll see in these examples that there's many opportunities to apply that within your organization. So to talk about just structurally how you even think about taking your cloud or IT team and you apply it to looking at things like cloud optimization. Reem's going to talk a little bit about what is a concept called a cloud center of excellence. And then depending upon the size of your organization, that may be something that's large and maybe something that's just a functional set of responsibilities that get applied into the business. But Reem, just take it away, just kind of talk a little bit about CCOE as a concept in the context of cost optimization.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. So CCOE, as Nate said, stands for Cloud Center of Excellence. For something like an enterprise organization, it's going to be a dedicated team or department that's responsible for driving cloud adoption, governance, best practices, and cost optimization as well throughout the organization. So it acts as like a centralized hub of expertise to provide guidance, support, and leadership to ensure successful implementation of your management of your cloud technologies. So from what I've seen at my time here and just in general at these enterprise organizations in a successfully governed and optimized cloud environment, CCOEs usually consist of the following roles and responsibilities. So we'll start with the cloud strategist / lead. This individual usually leads the CCOE. They're responsible for defining organization's cloud strategy, aligning it with business goals, and driving cloud adoption initiatives internally. So not everyone in your business is going to understand what's happening in the cloud. Why does it cost so much? What are these fictitious, costs coming to? Why is this happening? So you're going to need someone who can strategize and translate the business value, and be able to oversee the overall governance and coordination of the team itself. Under that person, you typically will have architects and engineers. So cloud architects, they're going to help design and develop the organization's cloud architecture. They'll consider things like security, scalability, performance, cost optimization, and they'll work pretty closely with project teams to provide guidance on designs and patterns to ensure, we are following cloud best practices. Engineers are going to work, very closely with the architects. They're going to be the ones who are the doers. They're going to implement and maintain the infrastructure and services in the cloud. So they'll configure and deploy cloud resources, automate processes, troubleshoot issues, and they'll work on things like infrastructure as code, DevOps, continuous integration, CI/CD, things like that. In addition to architects and engineers, the next two, sometimes they get kind of mushed together in architects and engineering responsibility, but typically at a large enterprise organization, like I said, they'll be their own role. So security and compliance specialist, this person's going to ensure that, your organization's cloud environment meets security and compliance requirements. So things like establishing policies, conducting assessments, managing access controls, encryption, all that stuff. They're going to oversee that part of it, oversee the governance framework, and make sure that you guys are doing, good audits throughout your time. Last but not least, our main topic today, the cost optimization analyst. I haven't really seen a person whose job is just to do that in my experience. But for a good rounded CCOE at a large enterprise organization, you'll want to have someone who is dedicated to analyzing your resource usage in the cloud, identifying cost saving opportunities, providing recommendations for optimizing cloud spend. It's something that Concurrency can do for you. And we'll talk about tracking expenses, implementing budget controls, and working to optimize resource allocations, such as right-sizing instances, leveraging reserved instances, things like that. And I know Jack and Nathan are going to be talking about that later in the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Reem.
Thanks.
Okay, so as that team looks to analyze costs within the organization, you can't manage what you can't measure, right? We've heard that term before. That is one of the biggest gaps that we see in companies being able to reduce spend in Azure, because they haven't put themselves in a position where they can look at the costs and understand what those costs align to or apply to. So oftentimes, Jack, other people will be presented with a set of Azure subscriptions. And in those subscriptions lives a lot of resources that are turned on. But the challenge is that those resources haven't been tagged with owner, business unit, application, dev, prod, QA. And all we know is that they're on. And there's a set of capabilities in Azure to be able to determine, like, when was the last time that resource was accessed, how is the storage being used, things of that nature that you can use to kind of figure that out. But that takes a lot more time than being able to start with effective tagging and management of the resources that are in the environment in the first place. So there's one thing that I would suggest that you do leaving this presentation today. It's you effectively leverage tagging to be able to allow you to look at the costs in an effective way. Because when you use tagging, that facilitates you having conversations about cost with the right people. So if you take an example in this case, you can see that you have things like the service name, you have things like the resource group name. Those are sort of minor initial versions that allow you just to kind of see how things fit down. But what you don't see is how do those virtual machines break out into the actual consumers of those virtual machines? Resource groups are a very weak way to be able to accomplish that. What we see more successfully is tagging. So for example, non-prod and prod. I can take the same resource And I can break it down into two chunks. I could say I'm spending $10,000 a month on the production instance, and I'm spending $4,000 a month on the non-production instance. That allows me to be able to start having a conversation about where I'm applying my resources. And what I should be seeing from this on the non-prod side, something more akin to this, right? The ability for me to turn it off when I'm not using it. But you can see it's very consistent. What it's telling me is that my non-prod instance is always on, whereas my prod instance should always be on. My non-prod instance shouldn't be. Another example would be business unit, being able to delineate the resources being used between corp, e-commerce, accounting, an app dev service, but even getting so far as to then clicking on one of those and then seeing the relationship to production, non-prod, and then further delineating based upon specific types of applications, this application versus this application versus this application. The ability to slice that then leads you to the ability to be able to do other things, such as chargebacks, such as actually shifting those costs into different parts of the organization. The worst thing we like to see is this, untagged. That does nothing for us, puts us in a position of real weakness because we have to figure out what everything does. And that is a much harder conversation because the second you shut something off, you might be shutting off the wrong thing. There's a tool that you can take advantage of to gain a broader inventory of what's used in the environment. It's called the Azure Resource Inventory tool. And what this does is it at minimum exports it to Excel. You can bring it into Power BI like we're showing here. And its goal is to give you a bird's eye view of everything deployed within your Azure subscriptions. And this is tremendously beneficial. When we come in to assess an environment, one of the first things we do is leverage this tool to be able to export the existing configuration and understand what the usage looks like. And almost immediately, you can see that there's opportunities for spend reduction, but also opportunities just for optimization in general, and opportunities for us to be able to improve the state of the operating environment. So we'll provide a link to this a little later. We'll give you the deck afterward, but this is a tremendous tool that you can take advantage of in your environment to be able to get a quick picture of how it's being used. So we'll start by using it in Excel, and then also you can move this into Power BI. You can simply Google Azure Resources Inventory Tool, and you'll find it on GitHub. Another thing that at a broad level you should be thinking about is understanding budgets. So one of the weaknesses many companies have before they even get started into reducing the cost is understanding, did I have an expectation of what the potential cost is going to be for this when I started? And do I have a alert configured that indicates whether or not the cost is exceeding what I originally thought it was going to be, so I can plan proactively for that cost? And one of the reasons why organizations don't tend to do this is because they simply haven't either gotten to this point from a planning standpoint, or they don't really even know how, or they haven't built a competency around this type of approach. So this is a really important staging point for us as you build out your Azure environment to ensure that it's built in a way that allows you to take advantage of budgeting so you can set expectations with teams that are using resources. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about things like controlling costs, things like leveraging resource groups to target high spenders, leveraging costing models associated with rationalization, which we're going to talk about in a bit, and then creating policies that prevent accidental over provisioning. One of the things most companies do is they use Azure Policy to apply controls around the environment. A lot of times those controls are centric to, like, I need to have this particular security setting on, I can't have an external endpoint. But what it can also do is disable resources that you don't want your people deploying because they represent sizing of a resource that no one in your organization should really ever use. And that's an opportunity for you to be able to lock that resource down to a very discrete group that may use them if they were receiving a certain level of approval, but the rest of the organization should not. So kind of your entry level, before you, like if I was setting up an environment from the ground up right now, what you should be seeing is make sure you have tagging rules in place, build it into a CAF consistent structure, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and implement policies that box out certain kinds of things like large resources that your organization really should never be using unless they had a really, really, really good reason, in which case you should probably find a new policy allowing just that particular person to use them. All right, so let's go through our ways to optimize. And there's about 20 of these. So we're going to hit most of these over the next 40 minutes. So number one thing is exactly what we just talked about. Properly tag and visualize all your Azure costs. If you're not doing this today, this is where you start. If you're not capable of doing it right now because of the way you've tagged, then you go back in time to be able to get that right before you can even do cost optimization. So that's why we feel so strongly about organizations having effective cloud governance, is because if you have effective cloud governance, then you can have this conversation. If you don't, then we can't have a conversation about visualizing resources because they weren't properly tagged. Those can be visualized in Azure Cost Management or in Power BI, and then allow us to be able to engage the target teams in cost reduction exercises as we noted. So that's starting point one. Do that or don't do anything at all. Number two, leverage reserved instances. Reserved instances are so underutilized in organizations. I'm not exactly sure why companies don't use them more quickly. I think there's like a reticence to choose to apply those resources because they don't want to make that commitment. They're getting like cold feet. Like, I'm not sure if this resource is going to be out there for 3 years. Man, like the resource saving associated with reserved instances is from 20 to 72% alone. So when we do migration assessments for organizations going from on-premise environments, we almost immediately start applying reserved instances because the cost savings is so stark. And to understand why, it's because when you do not use a reserved instance, you do not make any promise to Microsoft at all that you're going to have this resource on over a period of time. So you may turn it on today, you may turn it off tomorrow. So they have to plan their capacity for that. When you use a reserved instance, they get to plan their capacity around a 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year period. That allows them to be more efficient. It allows them to pass savings on to you. So one of the great things about reserved instances is that even though you're helping them plan capacity, it's not tied to an individual VM. It's tied to a quantity, a size of VMs. So what you can do is have a set of, say, 80% capacity, apply reserved instances at 80% capacity, and if you nuke a virtual machine, move it around. Move the reserved instances around, take advantage of the savings versus just let them run as pay as you go, which is probably the worst thing you can do because you're paying for an inefficient model of how to run that particular virtual machine. So this is starting point 2, right? Once you've gotten tagging in place, you can visualize it. Apply reserved instances as the starting point to be able to reduce much of your spend based upon the things that you know you're going to be running over a period of time.
Nate, another thing I can add there is I think we see clients have reservations about this. Wrong word to use because it's reserved instances, but you don't pay for all the spend up front. That is certainly an option where you can say I'm going to pay for a compute over a 3-year period right now, but you can also pay that monthly like you would a normal pay-as-you-go model. And that monthly payment of a reserved instance is not increased in cost at all about paying it up front at all, which is a common misconception that we see in clients when we go down the avenue of reserved instances.
Great point, Jack. Great point. All right, let's hit the next one, which is another, especially as companies move on-premise resources into Azure, which is a topic called Azure Hybrid Use Benefits. So if you deploy a new resource into Azure today and you have licensing for that resource because you had it on-premise, you can save really significant amounts of spend, up to 85% on specific resource workloads like SQL or Windows servers, where you've been paying SA cost for that resource. That gets deducted from the spend in Azure. But if you haven't applied hybrid use benefits, you're kind of double paying. Like you're paying for the license that you already have in your EA, and you're paying for the resource in Azure at the same time. So this is a really important resource to take advantage of when you have those Azure licenses available in your EA, and you can apply them to the resources you've deployed into your Azure environment. One important thing to understand is that if you're deploying new resources, ones that you have not, that you do not have a license in your enterprise agreement for, those would be ones that Azure hybrid use benefits would not apply to, because you do need to buy the license for that new resource. But if you're moving an existing resource, one that you've already bought the license for, this is a tremendous benefit and one that many people forget about or skip, and then they end up paying additional costs associated with the license that they're already bought. Okay, number 4, and I think this is a good one for Jack to talk a little bit about because you have a lot of practical experience with this, which is right-sizing resources. This is always the thing that people bring up, right? Can I optimize the workloads that I deploy into the cloud? And I'll say this is the stark opportunity that exists in especially on-premise environments, because our on-premise environments have to build the whole stack, right? They have to buy for capacity that they need at the max. This is the opportunity for us to say, we don't actually use the max. Like, we use a much reduced version of that, and oftentimes we never even spike. And this is a tremendous opportunity for us on the storage side and the compute side to align our resources to what are actually used. And if, Jack, you want to kind of talk a little bit about how companies take what they moved or even what they newly deployed and they optimize those resources.
Yeah, that's a great point about this. We usually run these exercises with clients after a migration, because a lot of the automated migration tools look at the current size of a VM, in a Hyper-V environment or whatever the case is, and then it'll match that size to the cloud. But it doesn't take into account how much of that was utilized on-prem. So in this example, and the picture on the right is a very real world example of a client that we did this with, and it's about a 400 person organization that's not large, doesn't have a big IT organization, but they recently migrated from the cloud. At this point, this was a couple of years ago. And you can see with built-in metrics in Azure how much a CPU is being utilized for a specific VM. And in this case, we went through about, I think it's like 18 VMs, and we ended up saving about 30K a year just in reducing the SKU of VMs based upon what the migration tool told us to. So this is a good habit to get in on some sort of regular basis, whether it's quarterly or bi-yearly, is to look at what the CPU usage of your VMs is, and then downsize accordingly or upsize if it's needed. Again, the picture on the left is all pre-built Azure metrics. You don't need to do anything special to get these. You go into the VM view, and you can check out the 30-day average. You can check out the 1% highs and the 1% lows to see what you need to optimize for. And like I mentioned, it's just as easy as that, and we saved 30K for this client in that short period of time.
Thanks, Jack. And remember that number that we said at the beginning, 20 to 40% of all Azure spend is waste. There's your 20% right there. That optimization could happen in any organization. And it really takes time, energy, effort, focus. It's not a tech problem, and it's not even a results problem for these resources. Having done this now, it's not like these companies like, oh no, our customers are all messed up and their performance experience is degraded, et cetera, et cetera. They're taking advantage of capacity that they weren't even using to be able to gain back those dollars and then be able to apply them to something that provides more benefits to the organization.
Yeah, Michael, you asked a good question in the chat about the priority of these. It gets a little less priorities. The priorities of them get a little bit less as we go on the list, but these first 5 to 6 are what you should start with. When it comes to order, though, we want to start with right-sizing the VM and then buy our instance of it. Because you buy an instance of a SKU, you want to make sure you're at the right VM size first and then buy the instance of a SKU for 1 to 3 years, whatever the case is.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Jack, because when we have the same conversation with companies about migration strategy, this is an example of math that we did for a company that is migrated now to Azure. And on the upper left-hand corner, you can see the pay-as-you-go cost, $2 million a year, which is significant for their particular data center. Their on-premise costs were kind of roughly equivalent to that. So their on-premise costs were like 1.9. So it wasn't a huge divergence on the pay-as-you-go side. But one of the things that you notice is that, of course, there's the reduction on reserved, but the recommended direction is exactly what Jack just said. We recommend kind of going in this direction, right? Which is it's going down into the right size zone, making the reservations, and then moving to the right. Not reserving at the highest capacity, reserve at the somewhere between right size and fully right size capacity, and then moving into this reservation zone as you do so. But do it in a relatively quickly space, because what happens is if you continue to stick up here, you're not leveraging reserved instances quickly enough. So that optimization should follow the migration relatively quickly. Okay. Let's talk about auto shutdown. This is like another one of those like tremendously underused capabilities that has amazing savings potential. The idea to shut down resources when they're not in use. Now, go back to the beginning, realize that this is tremendously difficult if you cannot look at your resources in an understandable way, right? If you can't go into your Azure subscription and say, these are my lab resources, these are my non-production resources, they're tagged that way, using auto shutdown to be able to turn those resources off and understand what you're even trying to shut off is really, really difficult. So again, reason why you start with that. Now moving into taking advantage of that tagging to be able to do auto shutdown on resources. Jack, if you want to talk a little bit about how this actually works.
Yeah, so when we talk to clients, I always want to think about compute spend, especially specifically with VMs, as in the hours it's on. So it's actually your build per minute, but I like to think about it in terms of hours. If you can turn off a VM for 12 hours at night, you're essentially saving half a day of compute. And like the previous slides we showed, this is all built into Azure. So on a VM page, you can set the automatic shutdown for a VM to turn off every night at whatever time. So if you're an organization that you only have users accessing something from the typical workday 8 to 5 p.m. and you want to turn something off at 6, that is a great way to save a lot of cost. And then on the weekends too, you're obviously saving 24 hours twice for 2 days. So over the course of a month or a year, you're that 20 to 40% of savings that is waste, you can really see. The screenshot below, the screenshot in black, is actually for AVD VMs. A lot of people forget that in Azure Virtual Desktop, there's a built-in feature to turn on VMs as soon as someone connects to it. So if you have your users anywhere in the world and they want to connect to a VM at a given time, they don't need IT to turn on a VM. As soon as they connect to their desktop or whatever they're using, that VM will turn on. And then you can obviously set it to shut down whenever you'd like.
Yeah, you said something there that was like understated but huge, is that the weekend is 2 24-hour periods.
Yep.
that alone is 20-40% on a resource, right? So you're talking about tremendous benefits just by shutting down things that don't need to be on over periods of time. Okay, this is a really, really interesting idea, and companies that have implemented it have been very successful at saving the lagging unknown resource problem. So one of the biggest issues we see companies run into is we all like to test stuff. So we turn on test stuff, and then a person leaves an organization and that test resource is no longer used because that person doesn't work there anymore, or they're not using it in general. And it's really complicated to be able to know which of those lab environments are used and which aren't. And sometimes people say, well, let's just have a weekend thing. We shut them all off and we'll ask people to turn them back on again. And although people talk big about that, it's pretty unlikely that they'll actually apply that within the organization. So it can be really complicated to delineate how that spend and especially try to take control of it. So one of the things that we've seen be very beneficial is using the CAF consistent landing zone framework, and we'll talk about that in a second. But even sort of attached to that is this idea of creating lab environments that are placed in a self-destruct box. Think like Mission Impossible, like this message will self-destruct in 5 minutes. The idea that the things people are playing around with go within these isolated lab environments that last only a certain period of time by default. There's no person responsible for this. This is automation. It shuts off the resources in there after 90 days, deletes everything that's in it, provisions a new space for the user to be working. That is their new place to deploy new resources. One of the reasons why this can be really beneficial is, well, somewhat obvious, right? It starts nuking things that aren't critical to your organization. It also allows you to build some competency around redeployment associated with the things that people are playing with. So if I am building something and it is important to me, well, it probably shouldn't be in a lab context either. And I should have some way to redeploy it. And it also sets internal expectations around that service level agreement. And if people complain, you could say, well, would you like to pay for this out of your pocket? And they're probably going to say no, right? They want to have those resources, but they don't want to pay for them out of their pocket. Well, we should spend money like we should spend the business's money like it's our own. And this is a good opportunity for you to be able to optimize that spend in the space where lab environments are used. Another opportunity is to be able to leverage auto scaling. Now, this is interesting because things don't auto scale down, but they do auto scale up. So it allows us to be able to put ourselves in a position where our provisioning is not provisioned for max. And we put ourselves in a position where we can auto scale up to a position where a demand meets, and then we can manually scale back down after that demand has subsided. So this is often used by organizations that have spikes in resource needs, or in positions where their applications they're not exactly sure how to build the application sizing. That's a big question mark sometimes in the app dev space, is like, how do I actually scale my app service? How many do I need? How many containers should I deploy by default? By enabling the ability to auto scale, it puts you in a position where you don't have to scale the entire operation on day one. You can scale it down, let it grow as necessary, put a budget around it so that budget notifies you when that scale happens, and then put yourself in a position to scale it back down as necessary for the resource. Number 8, using lab rights. So lab rights are one of these like Easter eggs that exist across the Azure environment. MSDN is an example of this, but a lot of other resources have free tiers. So one of the really nice ones to take advantage of is Cosmos Database. So Cosmos Database is actually a relatively expensive service. Expensive because it does a lot of really awesome things, which we could have a whole webinar on. But Cosmos Database, one of the complaints has been, I'm building an application. Why am I paying for Cosmos Database to be provisioned? And that's kind of jacking up my Azure costs. There's a free tier that you can employ for Cosmos Database for your test environment. You can apply once per subscription. Again, that's another reason why you break out subscriptions. So when you think about the appropriate structures of an environment, that's why the predominant scale model is to have more subscriptions versus less. A, because you can leverage free resources more often, and B, because it lets it isolate the resources into subscriptions that can be applied to different business units. But applying free tiers, such as with Cosmos Database, is a tremendous way to be able to save money. And this all adds up, people. Like Cosmos Database, if you have a lot of test instances of this, you're spending thousands of dollars just having test instances of Cosmos Database every month. This great opportunity for people to be able to leverage free tiers for resources where they don't have to be paying for it. Okay. Here is the political football. Third rail challenge. This is where I see the biggest delta between companies that are politically organized to be successful with cost management and those that are not. The companies that shift costs directly to a business unit have shifted the responsibility and authority to the right place. They've put themselves in a position where the application teams and business units that are using the resources are accountable for the spend. And they are in a position where by reducing that spend, it benefits them. In organizations where you're simply doing showback, you put yourself in a really dicey position where you're like, hey, I want you to reduce the spend, but they don't really have an impact associated with that spend. So the thing they really care about is a well-performing application, or they're getting the services that they want, but they're getting it without any kind of real negative associated with their using of that service. So the most successful organizations, they shift the responsibility and authority directly to the part of the organization that is using that spend, hold them accountable to the cost reduction that's available within that area, and they build a center of excellence like Reem talked about that works with those groups to be able to execute the reduction. The weakest model is where IT holds all the costs, and especially the weakest models where IT thinks about costs in the way that it thought about them on premise, which are like, they're over here, someone else is dealing with them, it's a hidden thing that nobody has to really care about, and I in the business just use applications. Successful organizations are shifting that cost directly to the business unit. That business unit is then leveraged to be able to optimize the spend for their particular area, and they're wanting that because it affects them. It affects their individual P&L. So if you want any encouragement on that, take this as your encouragement. Screenshot it, use it, take advantage of it. But this is 100% a best practice among organizations that are efficiently leverage the cloud. Number 10, this is not a technical thing, but this is a real life, how do I make difference thing, which is apply direct staff to cost reduction. So why is this important? Because if you don't apply staff to cost reduction, it doesn't happen. And when you apply staff to cost reduction, there's really one rule. The amount of staff costs that you apply to cost reduction needs to pay off double in the results. So if I take 16 hours of an employee and I apply them to cost reduction, that employee has an average cost. It needs to pay off double that employee in cost reduction in the environment. That's how we judge ourselves when we're brought in to do this kind of work, that the application of our costs needs to pay off in double cost reduction in the environment. And that's the same way that you should apply even if you're using internal resources. This is really the charge that you're applied to within the organization. I will tell you, this will pay off. This will directly reduce your costs. So if you will reduce costs simply by trying to reduce costs. If you apply the intentionality associated with that staff and apply them to that action within the environment. Okay, spot instances. Jack, you want to kind of hit this topic?
Yeah, so spot instances are a new Azure offering, and it basically, so like Nate mentioned previously, when you're getting charged for pay-as-you-go spend, it's because Microsoft is saying we don't know exactly in this minute how much is going to be used, but we have an idea of this period of time, this amount of compute is going to be used. And if you turn on a VM this morning and turn it off that night, that's no skin off Microsoft's back. That's just the way it's done. With spot instances, you can reserve what they call like allocated capacity. So essentially, it uses unused capacity in a Microsoft data center for your virtual machines. It does take away some of your ability to guarantee an uptime. So Microsoft doesn't guarantee that the virtual machine is going to be available for the course of a year like they would a normal virtual machine, but it does save up to 90% on compute when you go with spot instances. So this is perfect for like dev and test environments. If you're building out a test VM to test some image or deploy some test environment. It also works really well when you have resources that only need non-continuous compute. So like if you're rendering images or videos, for example, and you only need to do it for a couple hours a day, this is a perfect example of that. Same goes with batch processing. This also does not apply to like SQL databases or Cosmo DBs. It's just a VM compute spend, but it is something to look at. And like I said, relatively new, so not many folks know about this.
Thanks, Jack.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, reserved capacity. Reserved capacity represents a new capability where you're doing reservations for things other than VMs. So reserved instances are like, I've deployed virtual machines and I'm going to promise they have that virtual machine for X periods of time, which is great because that's what a lot of resources that constitute a lot of Azure spend. But what's happening is many organizations are building things that aren't VMs. New applications generally aren't built on Windows domain joined virtual machines anymore. They're built on containers. They're built on serverless platforms. They're built on Azure Cosmos database, etc. Right? Azure Functions. All these things are not traditional virtual machines, but you can still apply capacity reservations for them. So storage accounts, for example, one of the bigger cost sinks within an Azure environment is simply storage in and of itself. If I apply reserved capacity to my storage account, I can gain tremendous savings on 1 or 3 year terms associated with that capacity. And again, that's another area that many organizations just forget that they can do. And they don't apply within the environment, and they just keep paying the stock pricing. It's like going to Kohl's and never paying for a sale, never using the sale. You don't buy things at full price. It's the exact scenario with reserved capacity. So many of the new resources you are applying reserved capacity to and taking advantage of that. Okay, LRS versus GRS versus ABCD. What is this, Jack?
Yeah, so this gets people confused a lot. So this is basically about how redundant is your data when it's stored in Azure. So it's all about like physically where it's stored in an Azure data center. LRS is locally redundant storage, and GRS is geo-redundant storage. So locally redundant storage is when storage is redundant within like a server rack, essentially. Geo-redundant is when it's redundant across a region. So it's exactly as it sounds like. So basically, if a server rack would go down, your LRS data would go down with it. If a GRS or if a whole data center went down, then GRS would go down. But it's spaced apart in an Azure data center. So we typically look at this as there's 3 regions within, or there's 3 zones within each region, which is an Azure data center. GRS is redundant across those zones. However, GRS is incredibly expensive. As you can imagine, it essentially doubles all your storage costs. So instead of being stored in one server on one rack, it is spread across many servers, many racks. And generally speaking, it doubles your cost. With that double cost, you get about This is 16 nines of SLA guaranteed per year versus LRS, which is 11 nines of SLA per year. And what that means is it's basically what Microsoft guarantees for an uptime of your data. So in LRS, it's maybe a couple minutes a year you wouldn't have access to your data. In GRS, it goes down to seconds. With that being said, you're saving half the cost by having the ability for your data to be down minutes per year. And with that being said, people sometimes frequently, this is probably a different discussion than cost savings, but with LRS and GRS, when Microsoft talks about uptime and SLAs, it's not at one time. So it's not like your data is going to be down for 5 minutes one time every year. That's spread across a year. So maybe it's 30 seconds tomorrow, it's a minute in a month. It doesn't necessarily mean one time. So something good to consider when talking about LRS and GRS. We frequently see this misconfigured. A lot of our clients' data needs do not need to be GRS redundant. And that's the default that's in the Azure portal. So if you forget to change that, you're paying double, which is a little bit mischievous, but something to consider.
Okay, a related cost is premium storage. Jack, you want to talk about premium storage?
Yeah, so there's 3 different types of VHDs in Azure. So there's a hard disk drive, solid state drive, and there's 2 different types of solid state drives, premium and standard. And you can see I added the cost there. So generally speaking, it's about 8 cents a gig for a standard SSD and 15 cents a gig for an SSD. And then an HDD is 5 cents a gig. A lot of people, I don't know why we see this, they use premium SSDs for all sorts of dev and test things, and it just ends up doubling your cost on VHDs. And another thing to remember with VHDs, that cost is no matter what. If you turn a VM off, you still incur storage costs. So making sure you set Azure policies to require HDD or standard SSDs for test dev workloads is very important in reducing your costs. We'll get on in previous and future slides about orphaned resources, but this really comes into effect when people forget to delete a VHD when they delete a VM, and then you have a premium SSD that's a terabyte sitting out there for months. That costs thousands of dollars. It's happened a lot.
Okay, the same thing with archive.
Yep, same thing here. So archive storage specifically is about storage accounts and blob storage. There is built-in settings where you can configure data to be moved into different tiers based on when it's accessed. So generally speaking, there's a hot tier and a cold tier and an archive tier. A hot tier is a data that you access frequently, whether it's like a website image that's constantly generated or whatever the case is. It's more expensive to store, but less expensive to access. And then cold data is the opposite of that. So it's cheaper to store, more expensive to access. And we can set rules within the Azure portal to automatically move data into that cold tier if it hasn't been accessed in some certain time frame, whether it be a month, 6 months, a year. What we see is that like Nathan mentioned, a lot of the storage stuff is being used more now instead of throwing stuff on a VM. So we see the cost of storage accounts ballooning for clients, and it's just sitting on old data that hasn't been accessed in years. And implementing something like this can save a lot for an organization.
All right, orphan resources.
Yeah, so this is where I was getting at with VHDs. Before, I think it was last year, Azure finally implemented a button where you can automatically delete VHDs or like network interface cards, public IP addresses along with your VM. But before that never was the case. So you had to remember to delete the VHDs that were attached to VMs. There's other resources that do some similar things to this. We call them orphan, disassociated, unattached, all kind of mean the same thing. But essentially, we have a lot of clients who forget to delete VHDs after they delete VMs. This is another example of a company that is not a very large organization, around 300 users. And we found about 35 VHDs that were sitting out there, not attached to anything, just incurring spend. And just by deleting all these VMs, we saved 15 grand a year and something that was sitting there for months. Like I mentioned, it's really prevalent with VHDs. We also see it a lot with networking resources because people just forget about the networking side of things. But maybe your boss asks you to whip up an Azure firewall to test something, for one of your offices. Azure firewalls cost like $1,000 a month, whether you use them or not. So understanding that some things are out there that may exist that don't look like it's being used that are still incurring costs. And it's not as easy to see with the VHD. You can easily tell it's not attached to something. With some networking resources, it's harder to tell if traffic is passing through it. But that still means that doesn't mean it's not incurring cost.
I've seen this a lot in the AI environments where companies have these resources for the data science machines that have been spun up with Azure ML, and they are just sitting there. and these are expensive virtual machines because they're the ones that are running GPUs and so on, and they just kind of hang out. So exactly what Jack said, like it can be really difficult to know, like, is something being used or not? And a lot of the pre-work that you do is really what informs that. I think this is a really good time for us to talk about isolation of landing zones in the context of a broader environment. So what you can see in front of you is what's called a cloud adoption framework consistent pattern, which is essentially an idea around isolating the idea of a landing zone for a particular workload. So like a lot of people misunderstand what the term landing zone means. This is one was specific was for a data environment. So even in the context of a data environment, this is really relevant. So when people think about data landing zones, oftentimes they think about like their entire Azure environment, like the landing zone is the Azure environment. That's really not the case. Your Azure environment is represented by an overall enterprise governance approach, and the landing zones represent where a specific workload goes. So like a specific data environment, a specific application, a specific set of virtual machines. And that isolates that down into a subscription that contains a common set of resources. In this case, it's a common set of resources attached with a data environment, but we also would have data landing zone 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those landing zones present the ability for you to isolate those costs of particular domains of users, and then make it easier for those users to be able to look at Azure Cost Management, bring that up and say, this is what my costs are this month, and for you to have a partner that then works with them to be able to reduce that cost over time. So when you go back to looking at your Azure environment, the big question you should ask yourself is, am I using an enterprise structure that's consistent with the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework? Or have I piled most of my resources into a couple big subscriptions and then try to do resource optimization based upon that? If the second is you, it's a good opportunity for you to pause, figure out how you refactor that enterprise design and put yourself in a better verticalized scaling position. So as you continue to leverage Azure to do a lot of different things, it's putting yourself in a position where you can leverage the structure to your advantage. Next conversation is really around optimizing Azure Virtual Desktop, but in this context, I want to note that there's other services that fit into the same picture. So going from left to right really represents, at a sort of average basis, maybe not an individual basis, but on an average basis, the idea of more generalized, lower cost to a less generalized, more specific, higher cost per user. If you were to deploy it to say 10,000 people, okay, one person, you could probably say AVD dedicated could be a less cost than going down like W365 for the whole organization, right? So left-hand side represents Windows 365, SaaS service for running your Windows endpoints in the cloud from any device, anywhere, booting onto the device and using it on day one. It's used in M&A. It can be used in just generic users that want to use a W365 device, a dev box, etc. So it represents the most commoditized side of that picture and probably the biggest opportunity to drive that cost down. Moving from there into Azure Virtual Desktop using multi-user sessions represents a similar deployment model to how W365 is deployed, except you have your hands on all the controls. So AVD multi-user or multi-session is essentially akin to like remote desktop services, right? The idea that like I have multiple workloads, multiple users running on the same environment, but I have my hands on all the controls associated with that. Then moving into the idea of AVD pooled devices. These are dedicated devices that are pooled to sets of users. And then finally moving into dedicated. And the example that Jack showed user was an example of a dedicated device that is shut off when not used, but it still is dedicated to the user, meaning it has its own storage and it's put in a position where that user can turn it on when used. So it's important to understand that optimization of the AVD picture does have a significant cost associated with it. And this is a great opportunity for you to look at how generalized do I want to be for a set of users, and can I drive the cost down for the use case that I'm trying to use AVD for? Another big spend optimization, and I think really what we're going to do with this one is probably run an event specific to this idea, which is how do I use the Microsoft well-architected framework to drive the cost of my application architecture down? So a lot of the conversations we've been having has been like virtual machines and storage and Azure firewalls and this and that. Application architecture is a tremendous space where optimizing the way you execute it can drive down costs tremendously. So for example, we had an organization where their app services environment had to be scaled up tremendously because of the lack of work they had done on garbage cleanup in their code. So the code was messed up. So that required them to scale up the app service to be able to address the connections from the users. The actual answer was to clean up the code. Reduce that, reduce the size of the app services, put yourself in a more efficient position. Azure Front Door is a way to reduce the impact of DDoS and reduce the impact of your spend on the beyond that. Putting yourself in a position where there's local connection points. Using Azure SQL and Cosmos database on actual capacity needs. Sizing up Azure Container Apps versus AKS. If you can use Azure Container Apps, tends to be a cheaper option than using AKS on its own. The replication topology for target countries. There's so much that can go into this specific space. And this is where you go from broad to small, right? So like a lot of things earlier in the presentation were like big, wide things that you can hit cost optimization on tomorrow. This is where you say, this application is costing us $1 million a year. It makes us $30 million a year or whatever. How do we optimize its spend? And this is where you have to open up the box and really figure it out. But there is a lot of opportunity in these application architectures to clean up the spend. So with all these things, how do you like take action? How do you get started? So the most important thing is to set your organization's direction toward improving the costs and setting goals for yourselves. So putting yourself in a position where you say, in 3 months, I intend my costs to be here. And I'm going to apply a team to focus on achieving that cost. So performing a high-level cost review of the environment, forming a team with this focus, identifying the responsibility and authority associated with that role, and putting yourself in a position where you understand where you are and how you build a plan to be able to reduce those costs over time. This is where you start, right? And it's somewhat obvious, like, yeah, hey, we got to build a plan. Most companies don't build a plan. That's why we're here. So this is starting point one. This is something we can help you with. We'd love to help you here. This is a great way for us to help you get off the ground. So start with a review of your costs. Then you build discipline and standards. This is a brick by brick thing. This is building discipline within the organization. You start with understanding, then you move into defining how you apply standards across the organization. You establish visibility into the environment, and you start building the standards that the team will use. In many organizations, you have to retroactively apply those to existing environments. One of the best things you can do is stop the bleeding. So apply the standards to the new stuff, then go target the existing things in a cleanup effort. Brick by brick, you're making this better. Brick by brick, every month, you're reducing the spend associated with the existing resources. And that's one of the tricks, actually, is understanding that sometimes, even though you're reducing spend, your spend may still be going up because you're putting new things in the environment. So you have to be able to track existing state against what you reduced over time. That's very doable. Drive a monthly relationship with a center of excellence and establish that within the organization. Then fly the plane, run the new normal. If I had to do it over again in so many environments, it would be do this from the start. But many organizations just aren't there yet. So flying the plane and driving that as a maintained standard and not deviating from that standard unless there's some new service that gets created that your organization needs to use. Focus it on that specific consumer, set standards around it, then drive. Flying the plane, putting yourself in a position where you've established a normal that is responsible. It's like we always have a lock on the door of our data centers, right? Why don't we have that same lock on the cost of our Azure environment? This is exactly the kind of standard that we need to make a default within the way that we operate the cloud. So our suggestion would be to engage concurrency to help you. We don't charge anything unless we achieve 2 times savings in our work. Our goal is to help drive that cost down. We can help you organize the team, we can help you right size, and we can help you fly the plane. And this is an opportunity for teams like Jack and Reem to get engaged to help you to drive the cost down and do it with a greater speed to market and your cost savings than you could achieve alone. This is a great opportunity for you to be able to actually reduce spend. And in a sense, it's sort of an obvious proposition, right? We will save you costs and we will pay for ourselves. That's pretty good, right? So we can help you to be able to achieve that savings by us applying our energy and know-how to be able to drive that cost optimization. You can do everything we just listed by yourselves, But why companies engage us is because we apply the capacity and the skill and the rapidity to be able to achieve that outcome faster than what you could achieve it on your own. So when you close down the conversation today, we would suggest that you click one of those calls to action. We would love to help you get started, get organized. We'd love to even just have a conversation about how you can make this better in your environment. And for that, we don't charge anything, right? We just love to have the conversation. So great opportunity for us to help you gain some acceleration from a lot of these optimizations that we listed today. There are more. We just didn't have time to put them in here. So we started with 19, 18. This will grow and grow and grow. The number of cost optimizations that are available within an Azure environment will continue to increase. This is an opportunity for you to establish that competency. So we're thankful for everyone joining us today. We will answer any remaining questions. What does 2x savings mean? It means back to that statement that I made earlier, that if you invest X, you should be paying off in Y, right? So if I invest $100 in reducing my Azure costs, I need to pay off that $100 in reducing it by $200 of savings. If you don't do that, why am I doing it in the first place? The whole point is to reduce Azure costs, right? So if you're going to apply either your own team or us, it should be paying off and double the investment. If you don't get that benefit, then don't do it. Like if you have an environment so small that it's like a couple $100 a month, then that's probably a conversation to start from scratch and just build the right environment from day one and establish the competency. If you have an environment, however, like many of our customers that have out of control spend, lots of environment that they pull us in to help right size, that's a conversation where we then need to say, all right, here's our targets. In 3 months, we're going to get to here. And if we don't get to here, we're not successful. And that takes partnership of the company and us to be able to achieve that goal. So that's what I mean by 2x. All right, everybody. Nice meeting you today. We're thankful for you joining us. You get the slides and looking forward to having a follow-up conversation associated with these call to actions. Hopefully this was helpful for you today. I think it was a minimum helpful for us just to build the slide deck so we can use it over. So nice meeting you.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.